Today we are visiting Pioneer Park in San Diego, otherwise known as Mission Hills Park. While it may seem like any other unassuming city park at a glance, underneath the park there are thousands of bodies buried. The park was originally known as Calvary Cemetery, the second designated cemetery in the city of San Diego. It was a cemetery from the 1860s until 1968, when San Diego decided to turn it into a city park. As you walk around the park, you'll see remnants of an old adobe wall. This wall was built in the 1930s by the WPA after reports of theft and vandalism at the cemetery. This section of the wall borders Pringle Street on the southern section of the park. This section is by far the longest remaining portion of the cemetery wall, with the wall being completely gone on the northern and western ends of the park. The park also has plenty of old trees, and when you find these trees on old photographs, they're usually surrounded by graves. It's not until you make it to the eastern side of the park, which is the opposite side of the park from the parking lot, where there's any indication that there's anything different about this park. Here you'll find plaques listing 1,800 names of people who are buried at Pioneer Park. While there are 1,800 names listed, some sources claim there are as many as 4,000 people buried at the park. So in 1957, California passed a law allowing cities to turn abandoned cemeteries into pioneer parks. The last person to be buried at Calvary Cemetery was buried there in 1960, and in 1968, the city of San Diego declared Calvary Cemetery to be abandoned, and a plan was put forth to turn it into a pioneer park. The headstones were then removed and tossed into a ditch at Mount Hope Cemetery, but some of them have returned, as you can see in the distance. With the cemetery abandoned and long neglected when it was decided to turn it into a city park, local residents wanted all the tombstones removed. Eventually, a task force was put together to select some historically important tombstones to save. They originally selected 600, but residents protested and a settlement was reached to save 142. The local residents wanted the tombstones gone, fearing they would attract people who were into witchcraft and other spook-oriented things to the park. I don't know if that ended up happening or not, but a local Ghosts and Gravestones tour does stop there. The tombstones did cause some controversy later on, when in the early 1980s, the San Diego Union Tribune did a story on the park and featured a photo of some kids playing on the tombstones, which led to some angry letters from friends and family of people who were buried at the cemetery. Though technically, I guess they aren't currently gravestones, since they aren't on top of the graves. The gravestone for Captain Julian Ames, who fought in the Mexican-American War, was the oldest that I was able to find. Maybe the most prominent headstone at the park is that of Cave Johnson Coots. While the name sounds like a character from a 1960s DC comic book, Colonel Coots actually graduated West Point in 1843 in the same class as Ulysses S. Grant and was an important early San Diego pioneer. While the park is normally filled with kids playing, joggers, people having picnics, it's sort of surreal to think what is just under the ground. Now, I'm not a believer in ghosts and ghost stories, but the park is often referred to as one of the most haunted places in San Diego. If there are spirits there, I can't imagine they're too happy about how their graves have been treated. On the eastern edge of the park, you can see more remnants of the old adobe wall. As you can see, compared to the southern side, there is far less of it remaining here. I was also lucky enough to see some of the local wildlife on my trip. there's also a little more of the old adobe wall along the fencing to Grant Elementary School. Oddly, looking at an old cemetery map, there are no bodies buried where the tombstones are now, but there are bodies buried underneath where the playground is. Pioneer Park, or Mission Hills Park, is definitely an interesting place in San Diego, to say the least. It's definitely worth a visit if you're in the area, and as I mentioned before, some of those ghosts and gravestones type tours do stop there. So if you're interested in one of those tours, just check the itinerary of the tour to see if it's a place that it stops. Well, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and we'll see you next week.